have a lot to say, let's get into it. A couple of points to set up. Firstly, I think the info slide is pretty clear. You get to pick who and when you're attracted to and when. You can switch people very easily. We would note that this is people, not categories. So you could not pick, like, for instance, like petite Asian women as a category that you fetishize. It is specifically to individuals. Secondly, we would say that if this technology was available and widespread, the norms of the relationships in that world would likely evolve with it. Things like marriage vows would include the expectation that you Neros each other exclusively or long-term relationships. People would evolve to expect this to be part of an exclusive attraction. Thirdly, we would obviously regulate this. We would not let children under the age of 18 access it. We would obviously make sure it is only given to people who are fully able to consent. All right, 6 points of substantive. Firstly, why people can consent. We think there are 5 broad reasons. Firstly, you have a significant amount of control over your preferences. You and you alone can determine who and what you are attracted to. You have an enormous level of agency when this technology is in place, which means you are hugely flexible. You get a great deal of actual control over yourself. You are not giving yourself up to your primal carnal instinct like you would be on the status quo. Secondly, people know themselves very well. They have a huge amount of information with which to make this decision. We think they are likely to make a decision pretty rationally, pretty carefully. Thirdly, people are likely to have some level of idea of their preferences because they are horny teenagers. They understand the kinds of things they are attracted to, the kinds of people they might be attracted to. Fourthly, we think there are likely to be countervailing narratives, things like advising caution because this is a permanent change, promoting randomness and like the spice of life, so that people would not be like coerced into using this technology. They would likely be able to make that decision for themselves. But fifthly, even if you don't think they can consent to a full degree, I'm going to prove in the rest of the speech that the benefits are so substantial that we should rip the band-aid off and let people use it anyway. All right, first major point of substantive. This could effectively end or at least substantially reduce instances of pedophilia and child sexual abuse. People do not, for the simple reason that pedophiles are attracted to underage minors as a result of unpredictable brain activity and hormones and chemicals. But importantly, often they are compelled to act on this in spite of society telling them, you should not do this, it is illegal, it is immoral, you will go to jail, you are literally evil, one of the most evil people to have ever lived. If you give these people access to this technology, they are literally just able to change their brains, they are no longer attracted to children, which means they are not likely to access things like child pornography and fund the production of that. They are not likely to attempt to assault or basically do child sex offences. It sounds like a little bit like extraordinary and extreme, but genuinely this technology would improve millions of people's lives. It would have an enormous amount of harm. On this ground alone, this technology is a good idea, even if it categorically ruins people's relationships in some other way. All right. Secondly, let's talk about secondly, it's substantive. Let's talk about marriage and long-term relationships and how these get substantially better. There are 3 things to say here. Firstly, under the status quo, people very regularly, when they're in a relationship with someone, a committed one for a long period of time, they start to fall out of love. And that could be because they are missing the novelty. They start to get bored and used to their partners. They have sex so regularly that it's no longer as exciting. They begin to adjust and tone down their expectations. Obviously, that is not every relationship. It does happen to a substantial number of them. Maybe they just start aging, so people find them less attractive because society tells you, you have to be young and beautiful. Maybe they just have performance issues because they can no longer get as hard. All of those are real and significant problems with real impacts. People self-blame for not being able to love their partner or give them, the pleasure that they deserve. People feel unloved because their partner is no longer as willing to have sex with them. When they do, they notice a noticeable difference in performance. If you give people this technology, the ability to experience a constant stream of sexual attraction that doesn't ever taper off, that is something that makes people's relationships much more fulfilling because they get that closeness and intimacy over a much longer period of time and more reliably. Secondly, we think this technology is likely to lead to far fewer affairs and instances of cheating because people's brain chemicals are fairly unpredictable. People often cheat and seek out affairs because they are driven by an impulsive need for new things. They want to do new types of obviously because they know it is immoral and likely to cause pain to someone, but their brain chemicals just need to fuck someone and it makes them stupid. We would say that this technology is able to avert the worst instincts and the most base instincts of a lot of people, such that they would be at least marginally less likely to cheat on their partner, they would be less likely to blow up existing relationships, make them feel awful, tank entire social networks as people are forced to pick sides. And note this particularly applies to families with children. You no longer have as many messy divorces because one of the parents has cheated on the other and just categorically ruined those children, forced them to undergo an enormous amount of emotional stress and turmoil, and now having to split up that family. The constant attraction we get averts that. That in itself is a massive benefit. But thirdly, we would know that a lot of people around the world, marriages are not something that are done out of love, they are arranged. For instance, in order to secure familial relationships, things like religious incentives or maintain the maintenance of caste systems. And we would know, unfortunately, that is likely to still happen in both worlds. We would just suggest that at least this is a way to alleviate some of those harms and mitigate some of those harms. Because at least now, if you're forced into a relationship, which you would be forced into in both worlds, you can at least feel some level of sexual attraction. You can at least feel like this is far less miserable. You at least get some high degree of pleasure out of it. We would say that that is unequivocally a good thing if women forced into arranged marriages at least got to come home sometimes. This affects billions of people around the world, all these long-term relationships. It is good for kids and family stability. It is good for people's sexual health. It is good for people's emotional relationship with other people. On those grounds alone, it is clearly a good idea to give people access to this technology. All right, third point of standard. We would suggest this is also quite useful technology for persecuted sexual minorities around the world. For instance, in large parts of the world, people are actively persecuted and literally face the threat of death and execution by the state if they ever act upon their basic biological urges to seek out comfort, to seek out a relationship with somebody of the same sex. We would say giving them access to this technology at least allows them to reduce that risk, it allows them to temporarily change their attraction so they are less likely to get exposed by the state, they are less likely to get called out, noting this is private technology, it's in people's heads that allows them to change this. And obviously in those circumstances, it is clearly a good idea to at least give them temporarily the ability to no longer be as easily persecuted. They can change their sexuality until that point in which they are truly safe, at which point they can they can revert. We would suggest that saving people from the risk of execution by the state because of biological urges is something that is clearly a benefit in the same sense that preventing pedophilia is. Alright. Second last point of some standard about people entering new relationships. We would suggest that, firstly, people currently tend to think with their genitals first and their brain later when entering into new relationships. They see someone cute at the bar, try and talk to them, or things along those lines. A lot of relationships start like this, even if it's not 100%. And we would say that due to the rise of things like hookup culture, people's biological urges, a lot of this attraction tends to come before deep knowledge, which means there's an asymmetric information problem. People get attracted and fall in love with someone they randomly see on a train before they actually know anything about them. We would say this technology is far better because it allows you to become sexually attracted to somebody you're already compatible with, somebody whose personality you already mingle with exceptionally well and you already know to a far greater detail. This allows people far more information before entering in those relationships, which means they are far less likely to be damaging, they are far more likely to be fulfilling, they are likely to be with someone you are guaranteed to like for a long period of time. Secondly though, we would just say that this makes it far harder for people to enter into bad relationships, because as soon as they see a red flag, they can literally just flip a switch, no longer attracted to them, there is no reason to stick around. People can be far more selective with their partners. We would suggest in the vast majority of cases that is a good thing, something that we should support. We should support people giving people more information so they can have more discretion with their partners. Final point of some standard then on ending relationships, Sam's going to expand on this a little bit more. We would suggest that it is good to give people some more control over the ending of relationships. Whether that is leaving a toxic or abusive relationship, you can at least remove one factor of attraction, even if it is not the only or the most important one. It at least lowers the barrier to exit to those bad relationships in a way we would suggest is good. Giving people that agency is good. But even in normal relationships, when people experience heartbreak, we would say it is good that you can at least get a rebound successfully. You can at least guarantee that you are no longer going to be longing for that person's body long after they have left you. For all of these many, many reasons, this technology was a brilliant idea. Time to implement it.
Yes. Never mind, I don't actually.
Udai, if you,
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Cheng, first out. Whenever they're ready, first name.
Actually, that might be useful.
Yeah, you're gonna forget what emotion is.
Yeah, so true. Hey, you know me, I don't remember things.
I really applaud the imagination of this team to come up with 6 points of substantive. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually work. Ultimately, their case summarizes something very, very simple. That this technology appears to be incredibly attractive because there's such a high perceived benefit. The problem is you are never able to actualize the long-term consequences of the technology. You can never actualize how it's going to impact the norms of your life, how family chooses to pressure you into relationships, and for so many reasons, this is a terrible fucking idea. Okay, firstly, 4 points of setup. Who takes this? First of all, we just think everyone is probably going to take this, right? Why? 1, it gives you control. There's a huge psychological disposition to this. 2, it's convenient. But 3, social structures are highly likely to push you into this. Conservatives are likely to push you into it at the point so that you can only have families when you're actually physically ready for them, when you can already at the age where you can have kids and it's acceptable to do so. Or with types of people that it's likely to be particularly preferable as well. Arranged marriages, they've already given that to you. I don't have to explain that. But also, families are probably pretty likely to do this as well, right? Because you care for your kids' safety, you care for their well-being. It's incredibly likely you take this because you yourself probably experience the pain of love, of attraction. You're going to want to spare them from that kind of suffering. You're probably going to force them into this as well. But also, most people have a huge fucking fear of unrequited love or heartbreak in a relationship you have no means to control. It seems incredibly likely everyone takes this. What are the implications of this in terms of a second point of setup? First of all, we think if everyone does this, it's incredibly likely people will do it, not when they suggest, but probably when you first start experiencing attraction, right? Because then just from 13 to 18, you get fucked by being attracted to whoever knows what. You experience huge amounts of harms that continue in your early 20s, but it's a very arbitrary distinction they're cutting here. Likely over social norms, over time, it's probably likely this just happens earlier. Thirdly, how does actually technology work? First of all, it's psychological factors outside of your control is what influencing your attraction to the status quo. This will create intense sexual attraction to someone else. They tell you can turn it off easily. I think this is completely fucking untrue. For the very simple reason, when you are grossly attracted to someone sexually, when that gets to the point when you're in a relationship with them, it is incredibly hard to logically make the decision that I should just stop loving them, right? Even if that is a button to push. The same factors that make it difficult to fall out of love now apply at the point in which you're already in attraction on their side. They did not have this power. They had huge coercive potential in terms of what it would do in the future. Because at the end of the day, you might know that it was rationally just for you to turn it off, but you were still attracted to that person. That was an incredibly hard choice for you to make. Finally, how do people engage in this? They seem to suggest that everyone's just going to know how this technology works and engage in it really well. But I think this is likely to manifest in several really harmful ways. If you, for example, as they tell you, you're in their 6th point of the disadvantage, that you choose to engage in new relationships with people who you're already socially very cohesive with, I think it's likely to ruin equally as many friendship groups, right? Because the point that you have a platonic female friend who you get along with and think, oh, I'd like to date you, and you choose to get attracted to them, the potential fallout from that is huge because you've made the active decision to fall in love with that person, and there are huge consequences that stem from that. So, 2 points of substantive then in this speech. Firstly, how this harms social progress. Secondly, how it gives you less love and worse love. Firstly, on social progress. Right now, okay. First of all, attraction currently is completely outside of your control, currently, but because of that, there is a very powerful factor at play. You never need to justify the attraction that you feel for someone. People acknowledge these feelings of love. They are psychological factors outside of your control. They are somewhat random. How does that completely transform on their side? For one, now you have to choose who you're attracted to, right? This is a decision that is not one you're likely to make freely, but is one that, as they even concede themselves, is likely to be influenced by a huge variety of social factors. It's likely to encourage the kind of discriminatory, rational thinking. For example, you are likely to only date people of the same race as you because you know that is a socially easier thing to manage, and note how that's a norm that propagates over time the more people that opt into it. But it's also things like you're likely to choose to fall attracted to people that parents who exhibit huge amounts of coercion, that other people are likely to press you for far more. I've already mentioned racial groups, but also note how this encourages beauty standards more generally, right? Because it becomes so difficult now to justify attraction. You have to justify your choices. It's something so many people would find so hard to do, particularly women, particularly POC, particularly people, for example, who were naturally proclivity to being homosexual before they were 18, but now are forced out of that by their communities. We also think this just creates less diverse relationships. My team does want to expand on later. There's obviously huge genetic harms in terms of that as well, but I'm not really going to explain that now. But finally, I think this destroys meaningfully identity groups and creates something that is incredibly coercive. They told you consent to this because of the fact that you know your preferences, your agency, you know yourselves, and there's countervailing narratives that pressure you out of this. I think this entire point proves that's not true at all. Because at the point in which social institutions are going to conform you into making certain choices, even if you can consent to the technology itself, you cannot consent to the types of choices you will use that technology to make, and those are likely to be incredibly discriminatory, incredibly harmful. It might be fine for your relationships, but it's not going to be fine for people who don't fall into that context, particularly when I'm going to explain the second point now, why you get less love, why you get worse love. We think the average person right now does experience some degree of romantic and sexual love. Seriously, because of the fact that this is random, statistically, most people probably end up getting this. We think when you abolish human sexuality as a random factor of chance and it becomes entirely purposeful, this leads to huge harms on their sides. Why? Because it creates an immense burden on individuals when they opt into relationships, something their entire case never considers and makes it all fall apart so quickly. Why? 1, people hate rejection. The idea of being vulnerable in relationships is something people immensely struggle with because to open yourself up to someone else is hard. Usually, things like sexual attraction make you do that to an extent in a relationship only because that is a factor that is something outside of your control and not something you've necessarily chosen to do. Secondly, there is a huge shame in wanting something that many people see as unnecessary and decadent. At the point in which you're sexually attracted to someone in the first place, when on a net utility perspective, maybe that's incredibly, seems really bad. But thirdly, it comes off as really scary and aggressive when you are the first mover individual, and you choose to become attracted to someone, and they have not attracted to you because they haven't made that choice yet. That is one that incredibly makes you seem as creepy as someone who sees as you wanting someone from someone else. That is going to make it so hard for people to enter relationships in the first place in a way that is extraordinarily harmful and will seem as scary and aggressive. Finally, it's just going to be inappropriate in so many contexts, right? Anytime at school, university, work, all those environments, people where you're going to be socially you will be pressured into not engaging with this technology, minimizing the amount of chances you can actually use it in the first place, meaning that you're probably likely to have a limited selection and make worse kind of choices compared to the ones they tell you to make. What is the impact of this argument, right? Relationships, attraction, those are often the source of human meaning. They are particularly valued to so many people. Look at Leah's reaction when Sam tells you that they're temporary and don't last. I think what's ultimately proves though is now you never get to this stage. It is impossible for you to engage in a relationship with someone in the first place because it's so difficult for the other person to accept the point at which, 1, the high barrier to entry, you choosing to turn on this technology in the first place, but secondly, the other person receiving that and then hoping they make the rational decision to do this. I think the likelihood is people just get scared, they never do this. We never get the kinds of fulfilling relationships they want to see, but the ones we get are toxically harmful because you are coerced by attraction into not being able to opt out of these relationships. You are likely, in the process of engaging in this attraction itself, is likely to be one that's not taken well. I think this knocks out a substantial amount of their arguments. Whatever I haven't knocked out will be taken by the rest of the bench. So proud to negate this time.
I think it was pretty insane when Dan decided to use rhetoric in this debate about being a slave to what society expects of you, and just being a slave, that you are making choices about who you want to be attracted to. That you're a slave, that you actually have a degree of opting into the relationships which are going to define your life. So what we described to you on Affirmative is that right now you're enslaved to almost entirely arbitrary genetic choices. Even when I can recognize this relationship will materially make my life worse, even when I recognize that I am attracted to a shitty person who makes me really sad, I don't have a way of opting out of that. I have to live with the fact that I want to be with them, but importantly, I have no one to blame but myself. I have to ask why I'm so fucked up that I want to make my life worse. I think that is the biggest harm in this debate. I think it is genetics which enslaves you and constrains you to harmful relationships and harmful practices. That was the case we brought to you at SAM, and that was the case which Dan failed to respond to. Firstly, concretizing why people can consent to this and responding to some of the characterization. Then explaining why your choices get better, that is why you get better love, and finally engaging with this material about social change, if I have time, whipping out benefits for better marriages, etc. Firstly, on consent. Note, no response to this, right? And obviously, consent is very powerful because it describes 2 things. Firstly, it describes that people who take this drug are most likely to benefit from it because they recognize it's going to be a benefit in their life. But secondly, we describe that consent is important insofar as you are able to consent to relationships which are not harmful. All these 4 reasons are not responded to. The only thing they say is well, everyone's going to take it. Firstly, insofar as they don't describe a pernicious reason that everyone takes it, I think that is just a good thing if people make rational choices and do this to improve your life. Secondly, they say, well, people are going to take it earlier than described. You take it at 18 to 20. Same problem. There's no premise they give you in this argument of why that's bad. But I think we do actually give you pretty compelling reasons as to why you would be slow to take this drug. Because, for instance, media will still romanticize random romantic relationships. Will still romanticize being able to engage in this way. That means you're unlikely to give up the earlier period in your life in which you can engage with things like hookup culture if this neg bench wants to say they're good, but then you're still likely to be able to opt up into it later on. The next thing they say is that, well, it's hard to opt out because you don't want to give up the attraction. We explain that the social paradigm of what attraction means changes, insofar as it's now far easier for you to say, well, I can choose to turn off the attraction, so it's not something I should be, not wanting to give up. But also, if I choose that I want to get rid of the attraction, I think we're far better at giving them the choice to opt out of it, whereas on their side, you're stuck still being attracted to them. What then do we bring you in terms of more choices? This responds directly to their material about less and worse love, but I'll respond to the material they have there. We would describe that you now just are able to engage in a set of relationships which would be more beneficial, which you can't engage in under their bench. But also, you can opt out of a set of bad instances of attraction which you are forced to get stuck in under their case. What can you opt into? Quite simply, you can opt into relationships where you otherwise would not have physical attraction to people, and I think this is fairly common. Maybe I can't speak for everyone in this room, but I think that people are pretty naturally selective about who they decide is physically attractive. That means that if I can expand the number of people I'm attracted to by 5, I increase the chance that I find the correct relationship for me by 5. That's pretty good, because I think relationships are pretty intuitively important in your life. But secondly, you now just opt out of a set of really bad relationships. What are these 6 sets of relationships? Firstly, after heartbreak, when someone breaks up with you but you are still interested in them, you can literally just opt out of that sexual attraction so you don't have to live through that harm. Secondly, long-distance relationships, which wouldn't work for the fact that long-distance relationships are hard to maintain. I opt out of that physical attraction so I don't have to suffer from that. Thirdly, for example, your social circles are not compatible. I opt out of that physical attraction. Fourthly, where your life plans are not compatible. Fifthly, where it's just the wrong time because I want to focus in other things in my life. But sixthly, where it is not reciprocated. Because as I described, sexual attraction is rare, and thus the odds that someone is not attracted to you when you're attracted to them is very common. I just want to impact how important this is, right? When you form sexual attraction, which can't work, which can't go anywhere, which can't be reciprocated, that is extremely taxing. Not only do you deal with the immediate emotional fear of that not being wanted back, of feeling like you're vulnerable, but that is something which, as I described in my introduction, you blame on yourself. You ascribe that fault upon yourself. That makes you far less confident. That makes you question yourself. I think that is emotionally grueling, and we ought to avoid it. Also, insofar as we now just described that you open up the set of people which you can engage in relationships with, I think those relationships get better. What does Dan say conversely about why relationships are likely to be worse? Firstly, on the premise that most people find love, I kind of just regret this. I don't know how to reject this, right? For a reason that it is so rare to find attraction which works, but also that people are pretty specific. I think that in the status quo, people have kind of just formed this cope idea that relationships which exist are good. I think insofar as we change the paradigm, people's standards for relationships just get better. What else does Dan say? They say there is a burden when entering relationships, and so now you're simply unlikely to do it. The 3 mechanisms they give are vulnerability, that you now have to justify why you're attracted, and it's scary to move first. Firstly, we explained the social paradigm again changes. Of course, people are going to be the first mover if the alternative is that you just don't have a relationship, right? It means that people probably are more likely to bring up things like the plausibility of relationships in platonic situations, because society can recognize that if you don't, you're not going to have a relationship, and they probably want to avoid that. Secondly, though, the idea of having to justify why you're attracted to someone is just insane. Firstly, maybe you can talk about it so you don't end up in situations where someone doesn't want you to be attracted to them, but you are naturally. Now you ensure that when you're attracted to someone, that is something which is wanted. You don't end up with those kind of awkward situations. But finally, on vulnerability, under the status quo, you still have to confess that you're attracted to someone. Maybe they're going to find that weird because you have no obvious reason to be attracted to someone. I think that burden still stands. I think that therefore explains why under our side you get better relationships, but more importantly, you get better relationships, you don't get the tarnishing of love they try to describe. Moving on then to the material about social change. Dan makes 3 claims here. Firstly, they claim that you are likely to be coerced into choosing the set of people who are, for instance, of the same race of you, or for instance, are people your parents want you to be interested in. Firstly, this is obviously symmetric. This is a pressure which exists under status quo. The problem is that under the status quo, if you wanted to, you could not opt out of that pressure. We give people the choice to, insofar as they weigh up that it is better for their life, to be able to opt out of it. But secondly, I don't think that people are likely to turn on attraction based on what society tells them to do, insofar as a social paradigm shift that changes. Insofar as people recognize that attraction is more arbitrary, right? You recognize that it is more acceptable to be attracted to a different range of people because there are not ingrained norms about this. The next thing they say is that, well, you now can't justify dating ugly people. What? If people aren't naturally attracted, then the idea of someone who's conventionally attracted disappears, because everyone just chooses someone who is romantically compatible with them, and so you don't actually have pressure to make yourself attractive on the dating market and acquire all the kind of harms and cultural norms that ascribes. Instead, attractiveness just kind of stops mattering. Finally, they say though that you're pressured to do things like become heterosexual. We already explained why we would prefer to give people the choice if that is what they wanted to opt out of it, and all their material about why people currently choose to remain outwardly gay in countries in which that is frowned upon, choose to, still stands. The same reasons that you would choose to be outwardly homosexual in these countries, still a thing under Nero if that is what you truly believe to be your identity. They don't actually explain why having the possibility leads to harmful things. I think it only leads to benefit if people weigh up what like they prefer. Finally though, whipping the material they literally never respond to. We explain why you don't have to have things like messy divorces which tear apart families. We explain why you give people the choice to opt out, to actually make bad circumstances like arranged marriages actually enjoyable. But finally, because we provide more information when entering relationships, so you can suss out if someone is a bad person before you're sexually attracted to them, you must vote government.
It's going to take somebody who's truly known what it is to be in love in this debate to fully conceptualize the amount of things that are going to be lost in the affirmative team's world. Not just on the individual scale, but on the society scale. A society that doesn't evolve and change through things like intermarriage between races, through things like experimenting with new types of relationship identities, through things like polyamory, through things that weren't really acceptable, something that you wouldn't have chosen to do, but only did because of the arbitrary process of feeling a chemical flood your brain. That's a very vanilla world. It's a very plain one. It's one that I think is less rich and less meaningful. And on the individual scale, your life, if it's one that can be truly made, pleasant, plain, and free of pain by the fact that you can always choose a relationship that's never going to say no to you, never going to challenge you, that's one in which your life loses meaning. Because all of the arguments they offer to you in affirmative could be reasons why everybody in the world should get a lobotomy, right? Because then they can make better choices, they can be more productive workers, they'll question the government less, we'll have more efficient systems. But what's the fucking point? They aren't themselves anymore. They're just complying with a bunch of things that this small-minded team thinks is suitable for humanity and for individuals, and that was deplorable. Firstly, on the consent that they suggest you have in this debate, I know that this is a very and I hate to ID poll too hard, but I don't think that anybody who knows what it's been to have all of the devices of society used against you to take away your freedom of choice will ever make the argument that this technology increases your ability to have consent. In fact, it takes away the number one thing that has led to progress in consent for people that otherwise aren't awarded it by the structures of power. The patriarchy has always tried to force women into marriages that suits the patriarchy. The reason that has broken down over time is because women have been able to say, I am not attracted to that man, because people have been able to feel and relate to the look in their eyes when they feel repulsed, when they feel disgusted, and now, as Sam told you at first, you can simply say to them, hey, at least you can turn it on and get a really big orgasm after your arranged marriage that I'm forcing you into. That is the number one thing that will break down the current systems of protests and people getting together and collectivizing and breaking down the systems of oppression that are holding people down. That is the consent we care about in this debate, not the fucking consent of people who want to make sure they can maximize their career path at McKinsey so that they can get the fucking right wife at the right time, and they can choose one who is going to be really good at doing the ironing, and if she says no, well, we can pressure her into turning it on and saying yes, and I can get the marriage that I want anyway. The people who profit from this are the people who have power now. The power will not be distributed equally. Consent goes down in their world, and that was devastating for this team. They also told you, though, that this is going to deal with things like pedophilia. Now, they have two worlds in this debate. One where there's these romantic notions of love, and there's all of the ways that we feel about it right now, so only some people opt in, and they only opt in at certain times. They also think you're likely to experience a lot of natural horniness before you go ahead with it, because they think that you couldn't fully consent otherwise and know what your taste is or what your type is. Newsflash, pedophiles are people who, when they first experience sexual attraction, unfortunately, usually experience in that direction towards minors from the outset during puberty. Usually it can be caused by mental illness, childhood trauma, whatever it is, but at that point they have already felt it, and for the same reason that they don't seek out therapy in the vast majority of cases, they are not going to seek out this surgery. Maybe if they could seek out this surgery and it could fix them, you could argue that there's less pedophilia, but I would argue that there are already other things in society that they could be reaching out to now that could stop them from engaging in pedophilia. There are therapies to uncover what trauma it was that caused you to lead to that certain taste, which I'm going to talk about now in my next issue about how this leads to people having a worse life. This is secondary to the argument about we having worse love. We think you have less experience with love on net because you are less likely to have all the stars align enough for you to decide to turn on the switch, which means you're more of a novice at falling in love. You're more of an inexperienced debater, and like that's why you win less, right? Every time you get involved in it, it means you haven't done it enough times. So there's worse love for that reason, but also because there's no learning process, because you only turn it on when it's socially ordained. You only turn, and there's also no romantic notion of fate that offers a lot of utility while you are experiencing love. You can't romanticize about the fact that you were meant to be with someone because you know that you are the person that caused it to happen. And that's a great loss for art. That's a great loss for conversations between couples when they look at each other across the pillow and say, don't you just think this was so meant to be? And that's really sad, but it also leads to you having a significantly worse life. They told you that it's really bad when people fall out of love because they can like now turn off this random process where you fall out of love. Newsflash, it's not a random process, and it will be really, really bad to stop people from falling out of love. The reason that marriages break down isn't because of a lack of sexual attraction or chemicals, it's because of a lack of people working on themselves, working on communication, and working on skills that make them more adept and good at being a lover. The people who have the kinds of traits where they want to experience a variety of sexual attraction probably still want to experience a variety of sexual attraction for the same reasons, even when they have control over it. Because they're people who seek like experiences of novelty. They're people who tend to get bored and restless. They're people who don't necessarily suit the idea or the feeling of being tied down. It's more of a power structure thing in a lot of cases. And so you would be incentivized, and also it probably would be a social status symbol, you know, at work to like turn it on for the secretary and be the fucking big boss guy who fucked her. And that is something that you would still do if you were one of those people. Those are unsalvageable for this side of the debate. But you end up with a worse life in terms of the people who stay, less utility the more time they spend in a relationship. Sam tells you the longer the relationship, the better. I don't think being in a relationship has any purpose if that person has no incentive to do good things for you and make your life materially better. That incentive is taken away now because they don't need to get you to try to want to fuck them. You already automatically have a machine in your head that does it for them. You're gonna have like the fattest husbands in this world, just as an aside. Okay, moving on then to how this leads to a worse life. Firstly, this takes away the number one learning mechanism that we have to learn about ourselves and to contribute to our psychological growth. Your kinks, your trauma, what your parents fucking fucked you up with is all can be learned about by the way that you choose who you are attracted to right now. That's not an arbitrary process. It comes from two things. It comes from mental trauma and it comes from genetics. Both of those things, you will have a worse life if you lose them. Firstly, because if you are with someone who you are not genetically compatible with, whose pheromones didn't play a role in you two getting together, it's highly likely that you won't be able to conceive, especially with the increasing rates of infertility. And that's really fucking sad. That's going to break your heart. But also, it's highly likely that you're going to have a worse life in terms of you don't ever learn in your pattern of relationships about the fact that you might have a need for control or that you might have a need for something like that. Finally, we think that this absolutely inhibits social progress in a really bad way. There'll be less gay people. There wouldn't be like, RuPaul. That's really sad. And also I think that overall there'll be less people who are able to experiment with things like masturbating. I think there'd be less orgasms on net. I think you wouldn't be able to overcome the shame and turn it on for a porn channel and get to experience that sweet, sweet oxytocin on a daily level, especially if you're a woman or a minority. And that was a massive loss. Because at the end of this debate, what's the point of being alive? Is it to be a lobotomized productive machine, or is it to be lost in a sea of attraction and a sea of love that you're an expert of being a part of because you're...
To start that ending material on porn and masturbation, because I think it's funny, which is to say, can't you just turn this onto yourself when you want to masturbate, and as a result you don't need porn as a stimulant, which means if people don't need to watch porn, it also kills the porn industry, which objectively is a massive benefit on the outside house, but it's exploitative and also is oppressive towards women. Not all women decide affirmative. Now to the crux of this debate. On love, Dan gives a set of reasons as to why this technology is quite coercive. He mentions norms, social pressure, and fear. But the thing you have to be comparative to is you can't control your hormones or pheromones either. You can't control who you are sexually attracted to. And this is why the pedophilia material is important, right? Because you cannot control your attraction to children, even if you want to feel otherwise. I know it sounded like a meme when Trotter said it, but the reality is, it makes you feel miserable because you make yourself an outcast. You know it is wrong to want to sleep with a minor. You also know that it is something criminal, and that if you act on it, you're likely to traumatize another person. Leah's suggestion is, well, you can get things like therapy or help yourselves in other ways. No, because it is criminal. Of course you're not going to go to a therapist who's going to rat you out, or alternatively tell anyone you're attracted to children. This actually is a mechanism which occurs in private, and you can opt into it yourself. But what else does Leah add? Leah goes, well, it is also coerced because of patriarchal structures which make women want to be housewives and their McKinsey consultant husbands. My first response is, guys, this isn't the 1500s. Fucking social movements exist these days, right? Like, women know what it means to want to have their own life, to be able to vote, to be able to access civil and political liberties. To the extent that is true, if a man was going to be so coercive and was like, hey, turn on your sexual attraction to me, so you can be a housewife and be a McKinsey consultant, pretty big red flag, right? Because you try to skip every single process in entering into a relationship and get straight to the fucking. That therefore meant this ID poll argument simply was not going to stand in this debate. But also, secondly, insofar as people are likely to do that, obviously there's also going to be massive backlash when women come out with their experiences as to why their husbands coerce them to do this to them. Probably means there's going to be quite a lot of scrutiny and quite a lot of accountability. To the extent this doesn't wipe your memory, if you go, well, I'm really sexually attracted to my husband, but only because he made me turn on a switch, seems quite bad, and that seems to act against any of these coercive features. The last thing here was this really silly analogy about lobotomizing yourself. Like, obviously it's different. Lobotomizing yourself makes you lose your memories. You still have all your thoughts there. I thought it was a truly insane claim. But what else do we hear? The next thing here is, oh yes, so the first thing is that it is bad when you come to falling in love because you don't go through the same processes of learning for other people. And the first thing to note here is that there is actually a distinction between sexual love and romantic love and platonic love. And obviously, even if you can control who you're sexually attracted to, you still have the process of getting to meet someone, to learn about their interests, to learn about their hobbies, to also find why they're so funny or why they're so endearing, and all these things you love about them. The fact that you have really great conversations about, I don't know, fucking debating, are ways in which people can actually grow to learn each other. But often the problem is, in these circumstances, sexual attraction never keeps up, but we're able to change that. But also, secondly, the material on art about how no one makes any good art anymore, obviously you still can for the reasons mentioned above, but insofar as you get less worse art of people falling in love with the wrong people, like Sally Rooney novels, very happy to same stuff. The last thing to note here is that then they go, well, people don't actually learn the love language because you jump straight to attraction. But it's also a similarly unpersuasive claim because there are processes in learning how to have good sex or how to pleasure your partner. Even if you're sexually attracted to someone, there are other things which make you feel better. I don't know, like a man going down on a woman, you have particular sexual preferences like your particular erogenous zones and what they actually like, what technique to use. All of that still can be learned and is likely to amplify your sexual experience, and it's simply unclear to you guys just because now you're attracted, you just go, yeah, let's fuck, let's not learn anymore. Incredibly insane take here. The last thing to note here is on the response to why attraction is crucial for learning about things like trauma and also about kinks. I also don't know why you need to have sex with someone to learn this. Just have a chat with a person when you really trust someone and you're able to open up to someone and as a result can tell them why it's happened in your life, why you are this way. As opposed to someone learning through sex, you have a particularly traumatic experience pertaining to a certain act. Obviously, I think it's better when you're able to have a chat about it. The last thing to note here then is she also goes, well, under your side, we don't, this is really messy, sorry, lots of thoughts, is to say, some people are unsalvageable and still likely to cheat on their wives, which means you don't actually save that many marriages. Like, the point here to note is that, yes, those people are unsalvageable, but the vast majority of people don't want to cheat. It's often a mistake. It's why they feel remorse, because they recognize they've hurt someone, but also recognize the society as a sanction of this material. But these people who are inclined to feel this way because their life has been a little bit monotonous and a little bit dull, at least they don't have to take this action, which really ruins kind of their happiness there. The thing you have to understand this debate is, under our side, I think relationships get far more better. And to no response to the material which Sam tells you about why people are likely to enter into relationships better, because you don't think sex first and then compatibility after. You think compatibility first and then sex afterwards. And that's quite important because it means you understand the person better. You're able to become different, you're able to grow trust as opposed to jumping into a relationship head first and not knowing whether this person is good for you. The important thing to also note here is that this obviously doesn't manifest in a way where you're one-sidedly attracted to someone. That's super creepy when you put the switch on them. You obviously have a chat with that person and go, hey, I'm pretty into you, let's have a chat and maybe this is something we can do. And the second thing to note here is also this harm still exists under your side for the very reason that every incel who's who's attracted to a Stacey. Pretty fucking creepy, right? So as a result, I think we love better under our side. We help more people. We help them stay in love, and that is the reason why we score a massive win in this debate. Onto the stuff about social progress, right? The first thing which you hear here, which is like, you know, later dropped in Leah's speech, is that love is outside your control. It means you never have to justify it. Like, number one, I think you probably do justify it to some extent. Like, your friends always complain about your shit taste, and you'd explain why you're into that shit guy. The second thing to note here is that justification, insofar as is like maybe a barrier, isn't actually that hard. For example, you can just say, well, they're really funny, they're really smart, they're really considerate, they're really compassionate, we have the same interests, we work at the same firm or whatever, are all reasons which are very easy to justify to someone and isn't actually a massive harm in this debate. But thirdly, I think insofar as you cannot control your preferences, it is often even worse in the way how society construes these narratives, especially by conservative forces, who say that you're unnatural, who say that you're demonic, and say that someone like God has not chosen you. And that makes you feel way worse, because it means that you were born in a way which is just like unnatural, and you as a person is immoral from its fundamental aspect, and that I think is far more worse. So, what else can we do here? They go, it's also really bad because you have to conform to expectations like parents and race, and that seems really bad because now you have no intermarriage. Like, number one, once again, this debate doesn't happen in a context where everyone is kind of racist and only wants to marry into in-groups. It exists in places where people feel attraction to many different people, they feel in relationships with people of different races. And insofar as you have some racial bias, and insofar as you don't have any racial bias, or maybe in the subconscious, it actually allows you to love people from other races more, for the very reason that you become friends with them, and now you also want to fuck them. The second thing to note here is that even if it's initially unideal, I think to the extent, even if it's unideal, I think you have to consider the consequences, which is say these pressures do not go away under your side of the house either. People are forced into these marriages, people are forced to go into relationships which are socially acceptable to their parents, of which are harmful accrues. But lastly, when it comes to parents restricting your choices, it is only harmful insofar as you don't have any other choices. So for example, if this person has has a shit personality, is rude to waiters, wears funny shirts with Garfield on it, and you're not romantically interested and you want to leave, they force you into it, there's a harm. But in many of these circumstances, when it comes to race or class, there are like 1.4 billion Chinese people, there's plenty of choice in the world. It's unclear as to why this is a particularly large harm, why you don't have any choice. Like, insofar as my parents are require is, you must marry within your race. I've got lots of Asian men to choose from. I think it's I'm unclear there. The last thing to note here is that they go, well, now social activists die for the cause, and you totally kneecap LGBT movements. It's like, number one, you guys literally use people's lives as a social battering ram. Like, people shouldn't have to die for the cause, and insofar as it's easier ways for them to protect themselves, and it's something you should give them the choice to opt into. But also, secondly, LGBT movement, once again, still exists. And maybe people will go into the closet if they're in a world where it is very heavily persecuted. But activists in developed countries who do believe that, being gay is okay, and an identity of which being protected. I think these people are still likely to advocate and explain why, if everyone in your world suddenly became straight, probably a problem and things need to be changed there. So as a result, I don't think activism dies. This is a team which does not understand the misery of not being the misery of wanting to find someone sexually attractive when you can't, the way that people feel that, am I shallow, am I stupid, is there something wrong with me, why did we lose the spark we had before, are things which are particularly debilitating and hurt people in many irrevocably, unrepairable ways. I think this is why this is just objectively a good idea for the first time in any of these technology motions.
Everyone ready? Kat accuses the negative bench of lacking empathy. But we are empathetic. Clearly you guys have not been very lucky in love. The problem is, the side government lacks humanity. They want to strip you of the core of what it is that makes you human, the key part of the human experience. The worst harms they point to, the loss, the heartbreak, unrequited love, relationship breakdown, are things you should not want to give up because they're a core part of what it means to be human, and the loss of that would not make your life richer, would make it far, far poorer. Because you can apply the exact same logic they tell you in Druce's speech about how you're a slave to choices, to your own attraction that you don't control, to every other part of yourself, to your interests, to your passions, to your desires, all of which are also equally arbitrary. To strip all of those things from you, to instead institute control over those things, would be to destroy the very essence of what makes you you. You are the sum of arbitrary preferences, and that was perfectly fine, and you should accept that and move on, not try to strip what it is that made you a unique person. The first thing I want to do in this speech is deal with the argument they give on pedophilia, and then run through the remainder of their content and explain why it falls out. Obviously, they tell you that this would end the capacity to have an attraction to children, and therefore the problem of pedophilia. Several responses. First is that we already know how to do this. It's called chemical castration. It does not solve the problem of child abuse. The reason for that is obviously that there are deeper causes of this problem. For example, there's often a very large correlation with other sets of mental illness. Secondly, often people who engage in child sexual abuse are themselves victims of it, and those factors are unlikely to be removed. Lastly, there's often significant power dynamics associated that also do not go away. So at best, this team removes one factor amongst a set of at least 5, noting that also it's a factor that we already have the capacity to remove, which suggests that at best, they make a very marginal difference here. We explained to you that this is not a significant part of the debate. Second thing I want to deal with is just Kat's kind of flippant response to our claims around why it is that you're around stuff like, masturbation and porn. They say you could just make yourself attracted to yourself. 2 huge problems with this. Firstly, this already has happened, right? So it's a bit of narcissist, devastating end for these guys. Obviously, there's already enough shame around human sexuality. There's already enough shame around masturbation. How many people would be willing to look at themselves and then turn on their own attraction at themselves and admit to doing that? Obviously, that's really all part of the human experience. Thirdly, let's deal with their claim on consent, because it underpins their whole case, such that they whip it in 3 speeches for no particular reason. Restating the same arguments does not make them any better. A couple of problems with their argument. First thing is, we explained to you that every power structure in society would coerce you into taking the pill as soon as you hit puberty. Churches would not want you to be attracted to people before marriage. Schools would not want the distraction of you getting into relationships or you giving doe eyes to someone across the room when you should be focusing on your maths homework. Workplaces would love the increase in efficiency when there was no more office romance, when your mind was always on the job. And your parents would say, why don't you do it the responsible way? We'll arrange a marriage for you. There was no need for you to ever feel attraction. Secondly, they tell you you'll be very well informed, but you won't, because you'll take it as soon as you hit puberty. You won't take it when you're older. You won't take it after you're an adult who's capable of making decisions for themselves. You won't take it when you've already experienced what natural sexuality is like and can make a choice as to whether you can do it and can compare. And the reason for that is the only reason they say you do it when you're an adult is they model it in. It's not a policy debate, guys. You can't have a model. You should know that, Sam. Lastly, we explained to you that people have a significant desire for control, and notably, you won't be able to reverse this once you do it, right? Because people do lots of stupid things for sex right now. This is a world in which once you turn on this particular technology, you feel 100% lust for someone all the time. Notably, that's going to be very hard to turn off. It's going to be very hard to avoid. Imagine how many stupid things people are going to do in this world. That defeats the argument on consent. It means that all of the material they premise on it immediately falls out, and that costs them the debate. But let's go into the nitty-gritty and explain why this is the team that destroyed love and therefore should lose the debate. A couple of things here. Firstly, we explained to you the biggest harm in the debate by far in Dan's speech, which is that this homogenizes and coerces people into worse relationships. This coerces people into relationships that are heterosexual. This coerces people into relationships with people of the same race. This coerces people into relationships with people who are of the same class with them. And the reason for that was because that is what every social structure wants you to do. It's what your parents want you to do. It's what your community wants to do. The reason that in the 21st century we don't do that in all contexts is exactly because of the force of love, because people have been able to push against it. But in their world, they never explain why anyone would bother. Why would anyone stand up for love? Why would anyone stand up for a relationship that was harder when you could just as easily content yourself with another relationship and say, well, you could just turn on your attraction to someone else and it would just be fine. We explained to you that this involves the erasure of huge parts of human experience and huge parts of human identity that are independently valuable even if people can choose to turn them off. We say that they shouldn't. They accuse us of using people as social battering rams, but our argument was not that people should be forced into being gay. Our argument was that people who are gay have a revealed preference for wanting to be that way, for wanting to defend that sexuality, and you should not strip them of it via coercion. That was the argument. They refused to deal with it. And the same thing applied to their material on arranged marriages. We say that it was not good that you slightly mitigated the harms of arranged marriages when you radically increased the prevalence of those arranged marriages. And when Sam thinks a sufficient response to that claim is just to be like, oh, well, you come good now, so it's all right. No, it was not. Secondly, we explained to you that relationships are just much rarer now. Why? One, people are scared of unrequited love, so you won't turn on the technology unless you're sure. And we know that's the case because that's why flirting exists, right? People are too scared to just come out and say they're feeling for someone, say slowly escalate and beat around the bush, but you can't flirt anymore now, right? Because you're either attracted to someone or you're not. You have to go from 0 to 100 with the flip of a switch, and it was very scary to do that, so people were far more reluctant to do it. But thirdly, the norms would shift. It would now be really weird and aggressive to turn on your attraction for someone. People would be like, that's inappropriate. Why would you do that in the workplace? That would not be something that any societal structure would support. But lastly, and really the most devastating part of this, is we explained that all the forces that allowed this to occur in the past and still continue to allow for this kind of coercion to occur in many countries now become so much more effective when it's so much easier to surveil people, so much easier to force them to never have attraction to other people, because you can always be monitoring them to make sure that they're only engaging in relationships within the confines of arranged marriages that are acceptable to community and social institutions. You can police them to make sure that they aren't feeling attraction in the normal way. It'll be perceived as a luxury. It'll be something that you can only do after you've served your 40 years of drudgery for the McKinsey Corporation and finally allowed to move on. Why does this matter? Firstly, we explained that love was just what it meant to be human, but you never experienced love in the same way again. Maybe you could experience companionship with other people, but the form of romantic love that involved both attraction and those other feelings was never accessible in the same way, or if it was accessed far, far more rarely and only ever with one person. It took the soul, the humanity, and the majesty out of the world, and you therefore ought regret it. But secondly, we explained it probably tanks the birth rates, right? Because they concede you have far fewer relationships. They concede all of this would be far less likely to occur. That's probably pretty bad for the world as well. Finally, let's deal with their remaining two arguments here. They say it's good that you can't fall out of love or cheat. One, we explained to you that this makes it much harder to leave abusive relationships because when you always feel really lustful for your partner, it's so much harder to leave even when you know they're objectively bad. In the status quo, you have moments where you do not feel in love with them and you're able to leave even when you're in those situations. That is no longer true. But secondly, people put less work into relationships now because people are stuck there. So you don't need to love your partner, you don't need to look after them. Lastly, they say you can plan the optimal relationship. We say you'll never be given the chance by society. This was a team that wanted you to get in the pod. This is a team that wanted you to eat the bugs. You ought not do so.
Sorry, 1 second. So good to go? In this reply, I'll ask one question. Why is human sexuality meaningful? The position of the affirmative team on this question is that sexual attraction is sometimes useful, occasionally helpful at tying people to certain productive social structures, and often inconvenient. Their solution is to create a control surface between the individual and their sexuality, with the hope that individuals, along with this newfound ability to manipulate their own sexuality, will be able to make choices that better serve their interests. For that affirmative, the greatest harm of all is not having maximal control at all times. For them, biology is the tyranny we all try to escape. Side negative make two observations here that take the round. The first observation is that other factors control you, which is to say, the patriarchal control of one's parents, the control of various forms of noxious ideology that tell you who you ought to be best partnered with. The forms of control involved with religion, forms of control involved with educational institutions or the workplace, or racial or ethnic differences. All of which is to say that these forces operate on you and compel you to operate upon your sexuality and ability to control it in ways they would like you to do. Which is to say that an implication of the affirmative model is that these forces, perhaps to a degree far greater than they do right now, would seek to surveil your sexuality and the operation of sexuality. They would seek a far greater degree of interest and control over the choices you make because they know they can genuinely influence who you feel attractive and therefore they can thus exert their preference over who you ought to be in relationships with. So I'd negative point out, this means that people are likely to stay in relationships that are worse for them. They point out the relationships people enter are likely to be far more homogenous and eliminate essentially the prospect of queer or different relationships. They also result in relationships where people do not feel the pressure to work on that relationship over time, relying on the initial Neros attraction, and thus those relationships get genuinely worse for both partners over time, but they have no way of noticing or correcting for that because of the medically induced attraction that they experience. The only real claim we hear from Affirmative here is to observe that some forms of attraction, like pedophilic attraction, might be desirable to eliminate. We, however, have clear response at third negative, which points out, one, options for this already exist, which is to say chemical castration, and the failure of those options to generally work points to the fact that child sex abuse is not just conducted by pedophiles, it's also conducted by other people who aren't necessarily attracted to children but wish to harm or control children. The second observation that side negative make is we explain that sexuality is a constitutive element of your identity, by which we mean it is silly to try and distinguish between you and your preferences and your sexuality. Side negative asks you to imagine if you could have this procedure done on your personality, your passions, your interests, the things that make you identifiable from any one other person, and you could then perfectly control every single aspect of yourself, would you really be you anymore? The other side is only capable of giving reasons as to why various forms of sexuality, or a greater degree of control over sexuality, might be more socially useful in a variety of ways. But even if you don't believe our material, which suggests that it leads to people being unhappy but unable to really respond to that unhappiness, the hidden cost is that every person who undergoes this procedure, every person who chooses to have their attraction become a control surface, which they, but much more likely, the society around them controls, they cease to be that person anymore. They cease to be them anymore. They become something else, some kind of amalgamation of the broad desires of society. They seek to have that spark. And I will leave you with this. In Loving v. Virginia, which is the case that enabled interracial marriage in America, all of the social forces were pushed against those people. If they had been nothing more than the amalgams of the society that produced them, those white person, that black person would never have wanted to marry. But they did, and that's the possibility that side destroys.
Every time I hear a principle, intuition pumped in a hypothetical debate like this, the negative team always says it erodes the essence of being human. I have no idea what that means. And to the extent that I do know what that means, I found out in negative reply. And I think that's too late to find out what the essence of being human means. I'm going to do 4 things in this reply. First, I'm going to talk about whether people consent, whether that matters. Secondly, I'm going to deal with the clear affirmative wins that should give it to us anyway. Then I'm going to deal with social progress and relationship quality. Can people consent, and does it matter? First contention from them is that we can't model it. The motion says, to be only adults. The motion says we prefer a world where it is widely available. We give structural reasons why it's likely that you'd be unlikely to make that widely available for kids in the way that the world would be constructed. The second response that we give is we don't care. We think everyone will take it, and we think that's good, right? People can't consent to a lot of things. Those things tend to be good to them. We don't mind. The third thing is just to note the comparative. No one can consent to who they're attracted to at the status quo. We would prefer a world where you have some level of meaningful exercise of consent over who you're attracted to. Secondly, let's talk about the other clear affirmative ones. The first is on pedophily. We only get responses at third negative, so I think it's fair for me to respond at reply. The first is that chemical castration exists, but you can't do that yourself, right? And importantly, that would enable you to reveal yourself to the authorities, potentially go to jail. The secondly, they say is, it's from deeper reasons within your mind. But to the extent that that influences your sexual attraction, we cut it off at that point, and that means you no longer want to have sex with children. That is a benefit. We save all those children's lives from misery. The second claim is on the porn industry, and they said, but liberating sex is good. Maybe you won't be turned on by yourself. But I think there's a significant number of instances where we remove the power of the porn industry. That is great for all the women that are exploited in that industry. Another clear win for Team Affirmative. If you're confused about the margins on the major issues of the debate, I think those 2 reasons are just clear wins that you should give it to Affirmative. Let's talk about social progress. The negative case relies you to believe a number of very precarious premises. The first is that people are so beholden to social narratives that they will choose people of the same race over people that they are friends with. We think people have enough informed capacity to make choices that based on what they think will be good for them, in spite of social narratives in some cases. Secondly, they need to prove that the justification for this needs to be much harder on their side of the house for things like arranged marriages. We say that the same patriarchy is going to, make sure that arranged marriages happen on either side of the house. We at least give people the power to, reclaim some of that sexuality. Thirdly, you have to believe that women's empowerment came from women saying, I'm not attracted to you. But the patriarchy doesn't care about that. It has never cared about that. Women's empowerment comes from things like economic empowerment, like class mobilization, like standing together and standing up for your rights, not by saying, I'm not attracted to you. And fourthly, to recognize that the debate takes place in the 21st century, you already have some rights movements that can support those things. But even if you believed all their claims, the harm is minimal. Because, yes, we have a set of gay people in countries that don't support that, who are no longer murdered on the street, and that is a huge win for us. And for those who do choose to be out, at least they have the choice of not doing that if it did become damaging for them. So their most sympathetic stakeholder at least has an out. The people harmed on their side do not. There is no tangible explanation of the harms of social progress there that you can't have data. But let's talk about relationship quality. Because the first thing we say is you get into better relationships. They say people will be too scared to make the first move. But norms shift, and actually people now get into relationships with people that they gel with. Secondly, you get out of relationships. They say it's harder to leave abusive ones. But we present this at Trotter. We say there are other reasons that people find it hard to get out of relationships, financial ones. More importantly, we allow you to turn that sexuality off, right? If you are now attracted to someone, you can stop it if you want to leave that relationship. That's a huge benefit for you. But finally, and most importantly, we help people stay in long-term relationships. The only response to this is to say that people won't put the work in. But you don't do things for your partner purely because you want to have sex with them, right? You love your partner independently of that, and we do that on our side of the house. We allow people to both be fulfilled in a sexual manner and keep their relationships fulfilling as well. For all of those reasons, vote for side amendment.